Bhagavad Gita is a conversation. It's a conversation between humankind, as represented in Arjuna, the great warrior of the Pandavas, and God. It occurs at the heart of the Mahabharata.
So there are two great Indian epics, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? This is the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
It's very much like the Odyssey and the Iliad insofar as it's a foundational mythology out of which a culture has its touchstones.
And the Odyssey is kind of like the Ramayana in the sense that the Ramayana is, even the name, right? Ramayana is Lord Ram, right? Just like the Odyssey is about Odysseus. And, Lord Ram goes into exile and, there's the whole story around that. So that's the benign book. It's the epic that you will often see on people's shelves, right? You will never see the Mahabharata. And even the name Mahabharata, Maha is big, huge, right? That's what it stands for. It's a contemporary word as well. Whereas Bharat, right, is also a contemporary word and means country. So Mahabharata stands for great country, and but it's about war.
It's a cultural mythological touchstone in the sense in which Campbell, right, would see a kind of universal pattern at work there. Why are these stories about battles? The Gita occupies this space inside of the greater Mahabharata, and hence why it's such an essential text.
I remember once when I was in high school, I wanted to read the Mahabharata or some translated version, and I was told that I could not bring the book inside the house because it is considered to be such a powerful book that there's a superstition that if you bring such a warlike and bloody book, if you will, into the house, that you will actually create war in the house, that it will lead to war and conflict. I'm really reminded of Game of Thrones, of Billions, of Succession. It's the age-old battle between, two clans in the family, right? And who is owed what? Who should inherit what? Who should get the land? Who should get the throne? Who should get and what dirty tactics should you adopt?
I was brushing up a little bit about Bhagavad Gita. Of course, as we know, a series of holy books tacked onto the end of the Vedas, the Upanishads. And there were many Upanishads. And apparently, some of the later Upanishads came after the Bhagavad Gita and were influenced by the Bhagavad Gita. Particularly some of the very later Upanishads that are more theistic in nature.
You were saying the Mahabharata is the story of two
teams of brothers going to war against each other. The Pandavas are the good brothers, and the Kauravas are the evil brothers.
And that's a stretch to use good and evil.
And when I was doing some volunteer work in rural Uttarakhand, up in the foothills of the Himalaya, there was a holy site with a cave where the area was seen as a place of pilgrimage. It was believed that the Pandavas hid there for a period of time.
Is that after the dice game?
I think it was.
The setting of the Bhagavad Gita is the famous war on the field of Kurukshetra.
So we have the two sets of brothers fighting against each other, and they finally come to this point at this big battle.
And then Arjuna wheels out his chariot. Krishna is, of course, right, is steering the chariot.
Who is Krishna?
For Vaishnava Hindus, he's the incarnation of Lord Vishnu. Although I think for the Hare Krishnas in specific, they see him, Krishna, simply as the absolute himself, whereas in most Vaishnava Hindus, he's the avatar or incarnation of Lord Vishnu. So he's God, basically.
I mean, I am not a Krishna Bhakt, I am a Shiv Bhakt, so that's where, and in fact, I have a huge statue of Shiv right in front of me right now. So I think that it's complicated. I've come to realize that there is like a whole, ritualistic, just like many other religions, there's a very simplistic and ritualistic way that, many people take the religion as. I don't think it was meant to be taken in that way, but it's much simpler, right, to do that. Where it's like, hey, it's kind of like the equivalent of just go to mass, just go to confession, and you're good, until next week, and you don't need to go deeper into it.
Interior to the text. So you hit this point.
I think he's an avatar. He's an avatar of Vishnu, right?
He's an avatar. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting is the way in which we get these identifications, right? So, it's Krishna talking. Actually, in the backstory, it's Vishnu. Part of an interpretation of the text, right, is that it's a kind of monistic picture, right? That there's
That's one interpretation.
Yeah, one I mean, it's a okay.
That would
One
be
of the
like
topics.
Shankara's
One of the topics that to me is seminal to today's conversation is the inconsistencies, right? And what role inconsistencies play.
And how Shankara would have one interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita.
Correct.
Ramanuja another. You have different great Hindu theologians. Ramanuja and Madhva, the two great Vaishnavite theologians. But Ramanuja has one well-known, he's got one interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, Shankara another, and they would both, of course, and you can see how, because of all the sort of the texture of the Bhagavad Gita, the different themes that where they weave together, there is something there that they both can draw upon, just like the Upanishads.
So Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, and Vishnu is the preserver. Is that what it is? So explain. Can you explain that to me?
Well, can I jump in quickly?
Sure.
And Mayank, you can correct me. So in regards to the Trimurti, the Hindu Trinity, Brahma is the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the dissolver or destroyer. Some people prefer the translation to the dissolver, to the destroyer. And yet, correct me if I'm wrong, to a Vaishnava Hindu, Vishnu is all those things. And to a Shaivite Hindu, Shiva... Okay.
Not really.
Okay.
They worship Vishnu. They would never say that, Vishnu is the dissolver and Vishnu was the creator and Vishnu did everything and there was no role for... I don't think any Hindu ignores the existence of the three gods and their role. It is just that which one is the focus of your worship.
Well, what about the image of Shiva Nataraja, Shiva Lord of the Dance? He's got the flame in one hand and the drum in the other.
Well, that's me, right? That's who I worship, right? Very strongly. So I pray every night to the, and then I think for many scientists, the Shiv Nataraj has a very strong influence because there is something mystical about it. Like, there are many interpretations of that statue. It is also outside the Large Hadron Collider, by the way. Like among physicists, right? The Nataraj sends chills down your spine because we almost think of it that he is standing at the intersection of one universe getting destroyed and the next universe getting created. As we start to understand things like quantum theory and multiverses and, sequences of universes. And so I think that for the Shiv Nataraj is, has that kind of mysticism for a lot of scientists. And the dance is a cosmic dance because one of his feet, right, is actually on the demon. So if you look at the statue very carefully, there's the demon, who's almost shaped like a baby, but he's the demon of ignorance. There's a lot of rich symbolism here. This is where the danger of sounding too Western, which is that you're trying to fit all these concepts in sort of a paradigm perhaps that you're familiar with, right? Just like, this clan worship this god and this clan worship that god. And it's not really like that. Hinduism has never really gone through conflicts in religion. That is something very important to remember. Like we've never had something like, the Inquisition. So we've just never had those kinds of conflicts. We've had a lot of other conflicts. We are very comfortable with inconsistency. And I think that this is a very Eastern thing. We don't consider this to be a weakness.
So Campbell uses this image again and again and is, replete in iconography of Vishnu sleeps on the sea of eternity and dreams of the universe. So this is fascinating insofar as he's in some sense a creator god, but it's an unconscious creator god because he's dreaming the universe. Out of his belly grows the lotus flower upon which sits Brahma, the creator god. But Brahma's not really Brahma. Brahma just thinks he's a Brahma, and he gets to be a Brahma for extraordinary lengths of time and think, wow, I'm really the shit. But with those huge durations of time, perhaps between bang and crush, bang and crush, bang and crush, even he is caught in some sense with an identification of an ego that keeps him embroiled in karma. And every X number of kalpas, Vishnu wakes up, he opens his eyes, goes, oh, it's all me, goes back to sleep, and we generate a new cosmic dance.
So, Ab, you tell me, who's Arjuna? I'm guessing the store of Arduous.
He's a great warrior from the Pandavas, and he sees the enemy army, who are his teachers and brothers and family members, and he is horrified by the prospects of such destruction. So he has a deep, deep, deep crisis and doesn't want to fight, doesn't want to take life. He drops his bow in despondency. And then Krishna, of course, engages in conversation with Arjuna. And that's like kind of like, if you will, the onset of the overlooking of the field. And this,
but this is what really gets the conversation going.
That's exactly right.
Arjuna has this existential angst moment, right?
That's right.
Full-blown Kierkegaardian fear and trembling.
Yes.
Going, how on earth can I do this? This is horrible. This must be wrong. But I'm a warrior, so this is what I must do. Now, it's essential that Krishna has to be a personality god, because otherwise he couldn't talk to him, right?
Yeah.
Vishnu doesn't talk, right? He dreams, and he dreams in symbols. So we have Krishna basically saying, look, you're a warrior. Your job is to fight, right? And that becomes the
And of course,
sort of the
also the eternal nature of the soul. The eternal in man cannot slay, nor can it be slain. That's yet another one of the instructions of Krishna to Arjuna. Yeah.
So I want to ask Matt.
I mean, Arjuna is just seen as a character with an ethical dilemma, right? And by the way, I will correct you in what you just said, where you said that, oh, you're a warrior, so you must fight. That is actually not the guiding principle here, it turns out, or at least that's not how it's taught. So it's not because he's a warrior that he must fight, but because there is something very wrong happening here. So what he is told is that, look, there is a very strong breach of ethics happening here. It just so happens that the person on the other side of the ethics is your family. So you have to do what is in your karma. So you have to go and fight just because you're a warrior.
See, I would
Krishna would never give that advice.
We could dig into the text, but I don't think that's right, because the ethical dilemma is, should I slaughter my relatives, or should I obey my duty as a warrior? That's the ethical.
Because they are wrong, right?
No,
that's the critical
that's
part
not what
here.
Again, we could dig into the text, but
I can just tell you that as someone who has encountered the Gita in the past, one of my issues was this issue of without the ethical dimension, because that is the way it's taught here. And when you put the ethical dimension back into the Gita for me like that, it totally changed it for me. It made it much more powerful. Like that to me resolves a lot of issues for me.
Way, right? Yeah, and so I think this is where there are things which are not in the text, right, but which have been passed down very strongly in the oral traditions, probably. And, so there is this aspect where a lot of things in Hinduism are not written. And I can absolutely tell you that in pretty much anyone in India, right, like at least to my knowledge, right, and I know so many Hindus and, they all worship different gods and so on. But, most people, if you talk to them about the Gita, the reason they will never give you is that, Krishna tells him to fight just because he's a warrior. I mean, that may be written down literally, I understand. It's a very short text, really. As it's taught in the oral traditions, right, by the pundits and by the elders and so on, going all the way to my grandfather, and is that, it's not that, okay, your soul is, going to reach nirvana or anything like that. I mean, all of that is there, and I know that scholars study all of that, but the reason why that message has lasted a very long time is that it's the age-old conflict that you are facing family, you are facing loved ones, and you are having to make a very difficult decision, in this case, literal bloodshed. Right. And he's not afraid of, by the way, being a warrior. Right. He has actually been a warrior before. This is not his first war. He's fought before. He may have killed before. I don't know if that is explicitly mentioned in the text, but he is coming from a warrior family. So it is normal for them to be warriors. But what he is squeamish about is that he's facing his cousins And in the end, it's going to be, if he succeeds, then he's going to wreak destruction on the family. And so is that really worth it? Should he just go away? Should he just go back into exile? Because the other implication is that he's not just doing this for land and money and all of that, but that there has been a very strong ethical breach over here. They were promised, right, that when they come back from exile, they will be, they are going to be given what is theirs, and then they are not given what is theirs. And, that's kind of the breach of contract that really happens in a way.
Philosophically, there's a universality insofar as that character of Arjuna is something that anybody from any culture can identify with, insofar as he finds himself up against conflicting obligations. And that, right, that philosophically is both a great story in getting the story going, but then this is something, again, universal that everybody runs up against at a certain time, like, do I defend my brother, or do I do what I think is objectively beyond that right? And he doesn't know what to say here. So one of the things that I find fascinating is the issue of the way in which Hinduism is, again, leaving aside the fact of how old it is and how many different texts there are, comfortable with inconsistencies that ways in which philosophers genuinely are not. So one way of interpreting, right, why is that it's his role, right? You were born into this role. It's your job to do this. And it's okay. Now, again, I take your point about, like, maybe there's a more common extrinsic understanding about, no, they're the bad guys, but regardless of that, take the Civil War. Am I going to kill my brother who I grew up with on the Confederate side, or am I going to fulfill my role as a Northerner? So that sort of tension is something that I'm very interested in terms of what might be understood to resolve it, right? Insofar as, in chapter 2, you have, don't be attached to the fruits of your actions, right?
Yes.
And that's an incredibly fundamental idea, and I'm a professor of metaphysics dealing with things like free will. So that's fascinating to me, right? How that relates to a question of morality. If I'm not supposed to be attached to the fruits of my actions, that's in part given as a justification for why it's okay for you to fulfill this duty, because it's not ultimately up to you how this plays out, which in some sense then undermines what would typically be, and here I'll go Western, conception of free will, right, where in some sense I'm an individual doing my thing in the world. So you have a deep metaphysics here, right, of the sort of cosmic context in which all of this is happening. And that, John, was what I understood you in part to be, wanting to talk about, is how do I understand a religious text, right, that seems to be advocating a certain kind of military action, right, based on the role you're born into. And this is going to be a little bit crude, and then I'll back up a little bit, right? But I mean, when in doubt, right, always refer to Nazis. Adolf Eichmann would seemingly fit perfectly here.
No, but no, I mean, okay,
I think there's a very interesting point here, right? So in the Hindu language, Hindi, right, we have this word called takdir, which is a very common word. It's used all the time, and even in everyday language, we say, well, like we will say things like, this is written in my takdir, and it basically translates to, this is written in my fate. For example, I remember there was, someone got married in the family, and, the husband was wealthy, and then later on she also got a lot of the wealth. Many people in the family felt unjustifiably so, from her own parents. She got a lion's share of the wealth compared to the other siblings. And they are having their own fight, by the way, right now, just like a mini Mahabharata. And, people would often say, there's money written in her takdir. Like she's named after the goddess of wealth, Lakshmi, right, who was the goddess of wealth, basically. And I believe she was Vishnu's wife, right?
Who's rubbing his ankle, motivating the dream. I forgot her name earlier when I was talking about Vishnu dreaming. She's the one rubbing his ankle.
Yes. And so it's kind of interesting that, that this notion of free will, right, is something that comes up very indirectly, but very powerfully.
In the Western tradition, the role of morality and the role of spirituality are absolutely magnetized together, right? So if we go back to Plato, the good is necessarily magnetized to God, to living the just life. Whereas, as we've seen, Hinduism is much more comfortable with certain kinds of inconsistencies. But the fundamental question for me...
I'd say the East in general.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'd say there's a different, there's an acceptance of polyconsistent logic, meaning that each chain of logic has to be consistent, but they can each contradict each other. Like, let's say that, yeah.
Well,
I love that. I love that phrase, by the way. I think that says it so well. Polyconsistent logic.
What to me is so fascinating about the Gita is this tension, again, between duty and ethics, which relates intimately to this question of then how do we, if not make them perfectly consistent, what's a way of thinking it through? The great philosopher of religion, John Hick, uses in a paper called Who or What is God? And it speaks directly to this tension between, say, spiritual truths and moral truths. So there's a word in Hindi, kiriya. It is used when someone swears by something. It is short for, and forgive me if I get this pronunciation wrong, sacha kiriya. It is an act of truth. An act of truth is performed by using the accumulated power of some form of activity that you have done for a long time. So two key things there. The word is power, right? Not necessarily a moral concept.
Yeah.
And the idea that it's from some kind of esoteric or secret activity. And there are many stories about acts of truth, and here's a famous one. An emperor finds that there's a flood coming, right? The river's rising, the Ganges, they're in trouble. So he goes to the Brahmins and all his, scientific ministers. Hey, what can we do about this? And they're like, nothing. It's a flood. So then, out of desperation, the emperor says, "Is there anybody here who has an act of truth that could help something?" And the rest of the crowd is just kind of, looking around like that. And a prostitute steps forward and says, "I'm not wanting to offend anybody, but you are all wise." But I have an act of truth. And so she gives her act of truth. The Ganges recedes. And at this point, right, the Brahmins and all the ministers are kind of horrified and slightly pissed off, right, that this prostitute, someone who has lower standing, right, significantly lower standing than their status and their duty roles, could possibly do this. So they ask her, "What was your secret?" And she says, "Well, as a prostitute, I came to find that I could meet each of my clients, each of my lovers, as in some sense all equal. So it didn't matter how old someone was, how fat someone was, whether they were a king or a homeless person, they would meet them, she would meet them as an aspect of God." Here we have an individual who has more spiritual power than any of the, so-called priests and la, but she also still has lower moral standing in her job or her duty as a prostitute. That's something that, we got nothing like that. And
yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because the prostitute motif, if you will, right, actually comes up several times in several different ways. And throughout, I would say, the Hindu canon. So I know that in Durga Puja, right, again, the goddess Durga, there's a whole puja that is dedicated to her. It's again, huge in Bengal, but also in many other parts of the country. And again, Durga and Kali are considered to be co-avatars of the Shakti goddess.
One of the themes of my class is how religions become more subtle over time. Layers are added. It gets nuanced, new levels of meaning. So if Hinduism is very difficult to talk about, so many different angles and aspects to it, but if one sort of traditional backdrop of Hinduism, particularly out of the Upanishadic influence, is the idea of the renunciate, and the person who has to remove themselves from the matrix of action in order to sort of realize the identity of the eternal self with Brahman.
The realization.
The realization.
You use that word also, and that's key.
Okay,
yeah.
but the Gita adds something utterly profound to this. When Arjuna says to Krishna, on the one hand, tell me to commune with you. On the other hand, you tell me to fight a war. Which is the way to truth?
Right.
And of course, among the margas or different sort of paths toward the divine is karma yoga, where the idea is not the actions which add karma to the soul, it's the intention behind the actions. So you act, but you devote the action to the divine, and in that regard, it becomes almost a vehicle toward the divine. That adds something profound to this rich tradition.
Do you think it's even possible then to read a text like this in any authentic way exterior to the culture?
I certainly think so. I mean, you asked earlier, where would you put the Bhagavad Gita? Well, I'd put it as one of the foundational, essential texts of humanity. The challenge, and I take it that this is relevant, if I'm in a culture that supports it, it makes it a hell of a lot easier, right? I mean, if it's just me against capitalism and acquisitiveness, acquiring more stuff, yeah, it's bloody hard. There's a sense of, how do you keep your heart open in hell?
When I was growing up, I sort of fell into this, I would call it a modernist notion. I would not call it a Western notion. I would call it a more modernist notion that, hey, everything is kind of in your control. You make your own luck, you make your own opportunity. And then, as you start to grow older, right, and so on, you start to realize that, hey, there are things in your control and there are things which are not in your control. Like, it's just in everyday life, right? Like, if there's a hit and run, and you die, right? Or there's a shooting and, people die in these mass shootings. There's so many examples, right? Plane crashes. I mean, it's just not in your control, really, right? I think that in these conversations around free will and duty and what is kind of baked into your life and what is your choice, really, and what should you do and what should you not do, these are conversations we're having even today. And I think that that's the conversation that they were having, and, Arjun and Krishna. And in the case of Arjun, he had like a god, right? Like just telling him that, hey, this is the answer, basically. Like, this is how you should interpret it. You should go and fight. This is the answer. We can argue about what the real reasons were, but, he was told by a god that, no, go and fight, do this is the right answer. Don't worry about this. And we don't have a Krishna.
In this whole vast universe, there is nothing higher than I. All the worlds have their rest in me, as many pearls upon a string.